My name is Tyler. I am one of the co-authors of this book here, Learn PowerShell in a Month of Lunches, that talks on Windows, Linux, and macOS. We're going to be talking about PowerShell scripts and mostly where in the world should you actually write your PowerShell scripts. And the answer to that is on a beach with your drink of choice. But in terms of what you're going to actually write the script in, we'll talk about that today. I used to work on the PowerShell team a couple years ago, and I was on the PowerShell team for about 3-4 years. And now I work on the Visual Studio Code team. Back when I was on the PowerShell team, I was very involved in both PowerShell itself and the PowerShell extension for Visual Studio Code, aka VS Code. And now I've moved over to work solely on Visual Studio Code. So I still have, I'm still like tight with the PowerShell team. If you were curious in taking a look at what I'm up to on GitHub, you can also find me on Twitter if that's your fancy. My handle is just my first and last name. I'm gonna just go out on a limb here and say that like maybe some of you know what PowerShell is. PowerShell is a scripting language that is authored by Microsoft, which is where I work, and it's been around for quite a while now. It's the default shell that you'd find in Windows, but as of like 5-6 years ago, it is open source. It's cross-platform, which is why I'm doing this stream from my Mac here. In that kind of like modernization of the scripting language was also this shift to a new primary like authoring environment, and that's Visual Studio Code. Maybe you've seen this program before, but it's a code editor. It's a script editor, a text editor, whatever you want to call it. It's what you write stuff in. It's not to be confused. I want to be clear that it's not to be confused with the other code editor by Microsoft called Visual Studio. That's a totally different application. Visual Studio Code, also known as VS Code, is lighter weight than Visual Studio, open source, runs everywhere, Windows, macOS, Linux, and has a fantastic PowerShell extension that the PowerShell team themselves maintain, and that's what we're gonna talk about today. So, Visual Studio Code, incredibly extensible. It has a bunch of extensions that you can add to it. So, those do a number of things for you, and that's where we're gonna get all of our PowerShell smartness out of. I am using Homebrew. Wasn't able to properly install on my M1. I'd love to know what you weren't able to install on your M1. Because I haven't had any trouble in that regard. Just because I'm on macOS in this case, I figured we'd start from the very, very beginning, which is how to go and get PowerShell itself in case you don't already have it on your machine. So PowerShell, you can find it on GitHub. So github.com/PowerShell/PowerShell. And if you go down to a section called Get PowerShell, you'll find the instructions on any distribution that you are currently in. So I'll go ahead and go over to the macOS instructions here. So in my case, I'm on a M1 Mac Mini. So I'll go over here to the instructions for macOS 10.13 or higher. And it's basically just like get Homebrew, and then it's like install using Homebrew, or install PowerShell via just a direct download, or install from the binary archives. And like I usually just use Homebrew because that's just kind of a thing that a lot of folks who use a macOS as their daily driver for development and things of that nature use. It's basically macOS's package manager that is not really sanctioned by Apple, but it's basically the go-to package manager on macOS these days. So we can go ahead and install PowerShell with it. I don't think I actually have PowerShell, the stable version, on my machine, which is great. So I'm just going to open up terminal here, which is just the default terminal on macOS. And I'll go ahead and just follow along with these steps and do brew install -- cask PowerShell. And then assuming my my speed doesn't get impacted too much in the fact that I'm literally streaming as I'm doing this, I think maybe while this is running, I'm going to go ahead and also go over to the VS Code website, which is here, and I'm going to grab the macOS build. Actually, you can get the macOS universal build, and like, whatever operating system you're on, it should show up as whatever you need to actually download. So I'm going to go ahead and download that while we're at it, because that's going to be important for us later. So let's check back here. Okay, and it looks like I already had PowerShell installed. Well, in any case, you can get it that way. And at that point, you can just run pwsh, and voila, I have, in my case, 722. So I think I should probably do an upgrade here. What is it? Brew. I always get this wrong, right? Upgrade -- cask PowerShell. Cool. So that'll go and fetch me the latest one. I actually usually use the daily build of PowerShell, just because I like to be kind of on the bleeding edge of what the PowerShell team has been offering. This is just grabbing the most recent stable one. There's also a PowerShell preview package on Homebrew, and that's going to get you the latest preview version of PowerShell. So if you feel like trying out some new features of the language before they're out, that's fun. And honestly, like, even like using the daily build for me, which you would think would be like, I don't know, slightly unreliable, given that it's like literally the latest and greatest bits, like fresh off the press. But honestly, I haven't had really any trouble with the daily build. So the preview build is probably even more like totally fine. Now we should have, let me exit out of this one, run it again. We should have, cool, 725. So that's the latest one as of right now. You can see it's loading my PowerShell profile, which is like, the customization that I want to run before PowerShell starts, which is why my prompt looks all funky. It actually looks better inside of VS Code. I don't really use terminal.app as much, but I usually just focus on just opening up VS Code and using the terminal there. But in any case, this is just to prove, this is just to show how to go and get PowerShell on macOS, and you do the same for Linux and for Windows as well. So we did that, and I believe we can just go ahead and close this now. We'll come back to that, and my download of, my download should be done. Yeah, cool. So let me go ahead and open this archive up, this zip. All right, and of course it showed up on my other monitor here, but that's okay. All it did was it gave me a .app file, and I'm just going to drag that into my applications. Pretty standard macOS installation process. Cool. So now that I have that, I can go ahead and open VS Code. So let's just do Visual Studio Code. Cool. So there we go. And sure enough, yes, it's from the internet, and I trust it. Don't trust everything on the internet. All right, so here we are. So you've got VS Code, and right, let's go ahead and install the PowerShell extension. So this is just telling you about some release notes. Normally, you'd probably get this page as the starting page. From here, this is the this is the editor, so I can like make a new file here. I'll just do a normal old file. And actually what you'll notice is that it says like select a language or open a different editor. So I can actually select PowerShell from this list. And if I do that, and if you open up like PS1 file or a PSM1 file in the editor, then you'll get this notification here that says, do you want to install the recommended extensions for PowerShell? And so we can click show recommendation. And in this case, it's recommending to install the PowerShell extension here. So this is specifically the stable PowerShell extension. And also there's a PowerShell preview extension using the nice new hair icon there. That's the PowerShell preview. Even like PowerShell, like the actual language, that's like one of the preview icons. I like it. It's based on the PowerShell hero. If you don't know what that is, you can look it up if you'd like. This is the PowerShell preview extension, and that has just like a ton of really awesome like fixes and stuff that will eventually go into the stable extension. So you can use whichever one you like. Frankly, I think the PowerShell preview extension is, again, like pretty stable. So I'm going to choose this one this time. But, you know, if you're in an environment where you do like want to only use stable, whatever, you know, you can go ahead and install the other one. So let me go ahead and grab this one. I'm a guy who met you at Ignite like half a decade ago. Yes, Ignite feels like half a decade ago, doesn't it? So when you install the PowerShell extension, the first thing that you'll see is this terminal tab just kind of pops up in your face here. And this is the PowerShell integrated console. And the idea here is that this shell is integrated into the editor itself, and the editor and this console, this terminal here, are able to share state between each other. So what does that mean exactly? Well, okay, let me show you. So, you know, if you used PowerShell before, you can do, you know, type get dash, and then I can hit tab, and I can see, you know, all of the things that I can possibly complete get with. Also, on the editor side, I can type get dash, and I could see all of the commands that are available to me. So the editor side and the console side, they share the same state in that case. So, you know, I don't want to get too into the weeds of like all of the features of PowerShell itself. I mainly want to focus on the like interaction within VS Code and PowerShell. If you read my book, you can define a variable in PowerShell like this, right? And then what I can actually do is I can run this line in the console down below. So I could do that a couple of ways. Actually, here, let me do this first. So I'm going to paste that line into the terminal below, right? So now if I do $AS, I hit tab, I can see df is defined, and I get back 5, right? In the editor now that I do, now that I've defined that variable inside of the terminal, I can type AS, and you see that df does show up there, and that it's an int in that case. And so I'm able to, you know, complete against that. And then, you know, that's just another proof that they are closely tied. At this point, PowerShell is basically set up in the editor. For those of you on Windows, one of the things that you can do is, and like I said, this is more important on Windows, but it's also applicable on Mac, is that you can switch the version of PowerShell that you're using inside of the integrated console. So in PowerShell, there is a magical variable called PS version table. And if you run that, it'll tell you what version the PowerShell is that you are using. So in my case, I'm using 7.2.5, as I showed before, right? But one of the things that I can do is I can go over here to where it says PowerShell. And if I hover over these little curly braces, I see this button that says Show PowerShell Session Menu. And you can see that I'm using PowerShell 7.2. And if I click on that, what this will actually show me is a list of PowerShells that I can choose. So this one's like kind of important on Windows because sometimes folks want to go from PowerShell 7. They might want to switch over to like Windows PowerShell, which is the one built into Windows. That's like 5.1, and that would show up on this list here. So that's an easy way to like switch between the PowerShell that your extension is using. But I only have one PowerShell on my machine, the stable one here in this case. At this point, I just want to go like kind of rapid fire through a bunch of features that you would see in the VS Code extension. I want to say before I go ahead and do that is that a lot of the features that you see today, a lot of the decisions come from a few different ways. One being as close to what VS Code thinks an extension should do. So, PowerShell extension, it's only just one language. There are hundreds, thousands probably, of programming languages. There's kind of like an overall idea of what a language extension should look like in VS Code. So that is one kind of influence of why the PowerShell extension does what it does. But probably the more important influence is for why PowerShell extension does what it does is due to the history of editing of PowerShell scripts, which mostly came from the PowerShell ISE, which is in Windows. A lot of folks, when they started out with PowerShell, they mostly used the ISE. And the ISE provides a lot of what I just showed and a lot of other stuff, like the completions in your editor, like a terminal right there for you to play with, and this very simple but very powerful editing experience. And so what happens is a lot of folks go from the ISE and they move over to using VS Code, and they find themselves to be in an environment that is a bit unfamiliar, and one that they feel is a little too much compared to the ISE. And so one of the things that the PowerShell team did, and actually this was contributed by someone, by a contributor, thanks to the beauty of open source. One of the things that they did was they provided a command within VS Code in order to provide an ISE-like environment, but is actually using VS Code. And that is called ISE mode. And so to get to that, it's pretty easy to do. You just have to run a command in VS Code. And running a command in VS Code is super easy. It's probably one of the biggest takeaways from this talk. All you have to do is type Command-Shift-P on Mac or Control-Shift-P on Windows or Linux, like this. Or F1 also works as well. For me, Command-Shift-P, I'm going to type in ISE mode here. And this is like all the commands that you can possibly do within your editor. If you don't know how to do something, just try to search, try to type for something along those lines in here, and you might just get a command that does what you want to do. So in my case, I want to turn on ISE mode. So I'm going to just type ISEM apparently, and I see that I have enable ISE mode and disable ISE mode, and I'll go ahead and run the enable one. So what this is going to do, as you can see here, is that it like changes the UI a bit, and it actually like, if I go into the VS Code settings now, and to do that, I can either go to code here, preferences, settings, or I usually just hit command comma. I think it's control comma on Windows and Linux. But you can see here, so this is the UI version of the settings. But if you click on this top right one, you go to the JSON version of the settings. And basically all of these things were applied. All of these settings were applied when I ran that ISE mode command. And by applying these settings, it changes the look and feel of VS Code. So like the activity bar visible being false. There used to be some like buttons on the left here. Those are now gone because of that. So kind of an interesting thing to like see how that like works. But anyway, This is to provide a more ISE, simpler, I guess, experience to writing PowerShell scripts. And so that's what that looks like. If you have somebody within your organization that, like, I don't know, for whatever reason is not one to like try VS Code because they say it's too complicated, show them this. Maybe this will convince them to give it a try. And then as time goes on, you know, you start removing these settings, right? And so, like, okay, one of the things that they add is these buttons up here. This basically, like, these buttons, they kind of like move things around here. So, you know, in this case, I've now moved my panel in the middle with my editor on the left side. Now I've like completely hid my terminal. Let's say we don't really need those. We're good. That's just like kind of clutter, so we could just get rid of that. And now that they're not there anymore.